When the German Tiger tank first rolled onto the battlefield in late 1942, it looked less like a weapon of war and more like a force of nature. It was enormous, twice the weight of most Allied tanks. Its armor was so thick that conventional anti-tank shells bounced off. And its 88mm Kwak 36 gun, adapted from the feared 88 anti-aircraft cannon, could destroy enemy armor at ranges no other tank could reach. To the soldiers facing it, the Tiger seemed less like a machine and more like an iron monster. A British gunner who first encountered one in Tunisia later admitted, "We fired 3 times and it was like throwing pebbles at a fortress." A Soviet tanker described the same experience. "We felt naked. Even before firing, we knew our shells would do nothing." This aura of invincibility gave birth to a legend. Newspapers and propaganda reels spread the image of the Tiger as the apex predator of armored warfare. Allied soldiers whispered about it as if it were a ghostly presence. For German crews, climbing inside one meant they were chosen for an elite assignment. The Tiger was not just a tank, it was a symbol of fear. But here lies the paradox. For all its armor, for all its firepower, for all its terrifying reputation, most of the men who crewed these machines did not survive the war. Post-war studies, drawn from German and Allied archives, reveal a chilling statistic. Nearly 3 out of every 4 Tiger tank crewmen never returned home. 73%. An attrition rate far higher than crews of American Shermans or Soviet T-34s. So, why? The answer lies not only in enemy fire, but in design, doctrine, and orders from the very top of the Third Reich. The Tiger was a marvel of engineering, but it was also over-engineered. It demanded constant maintenance, devoured fuel, and often broke down far from repair depots. And once stranded, its crew faced grim odds. Allied aircraft prowled the skies. Artillery could pound immobilized tanks into wreckage. And Hitler's standing directives left crews with little choice but to stay and fight. German combat records from the Eastern Front paint the picture. Units like Schwere Panzerabteilung 502, the first to field Tigers near Leningrad, reported stunning kill ratios. Dozens of Soviet tanks destroyed for the loss of a single Tiger. But those losses mounted. When a Tiger was hit or immobilized, its crew often never made it back. Soviet infantry swarmed disabled tanks with grenades and Molotov cocktails. Few men escaped. The Tiger's mystique then hid a terrible reality. To the world, it looked like invulnerability made of steel. To the crews, it became something else entirely, a coffin on tracks. Allied intelligence slowly uncovered this contradiction. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey reports from 1945 noted that German heavy tank battalions suffered catastrophic crew losses despite their armored superiority. Captured German tankers admitted under interrogation that being assigned to a Tiger unit was a death sentence. "We knew we would not come back," one crewman recalled.
This is the shadow side of the Tiger's legend. Behind the stories of battlefield dominance was the silent truth that Germany could not replace its men as easily as it built its tanks. Every loss of a crew was permanent, and as the war dragged on, replacements became younger, less experienced, and just as doomed. The story of the Tiger is not only the tale of a weapon, it is the story of the men inside, trained, disciplined, and condemned by decisions far above them. Hitler demanded that the Tiger stand as a symbol of unstoppable power. Instead, it became a symbol of sacrifice, waste, and inevitability. The statistic, 73% dead, forces us to see the Tiger not as an iron monster, but as a trap. For all its strength, for all its fearsome presence, most of the men who fought in it never saw home again. And it began with the myth of invincibility. The Tiger tank did not appear overnight. Its birth was the result of an arms race in steel, one where Germany was desperately trying to keep pace with the Soviet T-34. When Hitler first saw the T-34 in 1941 with its sloped armor and powerful gun, he was shocked. The standard German Panzer III and IV suddenly looked obsolete. His response was immediate: build something bigger, heavier, deadlier. Two German companies, Henschel and Porsche, were pitted against each other in a contest to design this new heavy tank. In April 1942, prototypes were tested before Hitler himself. Porsche's design was ambitious, but riddled with mechanical flaws. Henschel's model, boxy and brutal, proved more reliable. It won the contract. The Tiger I was born. But building the Tiger was no simple feat. Each tank required over 300,000 man-hours to produce, 5 times more than a Sherman and nearly 10 times the effort of a T-34. Where the United States rolled Shermans off assembly lines by the tens of thousands, Germany could only trickle out Tigers in the hundreds. By the end of the war, just 1,347 Tiger I tanks had been built. This scarcity gave the Tiger a strange aura. It was not a common weapon, but a rare instrument of terror. Crews assigned to Tigers were considered elite. They were hand-picked, often from experienced panzer units, trained rigorously in handling the complexities of the 57-ton behemoth. Manuals stressed precision. Every crewman was expected to function like a cog in a machine, from loader to driver to commander. And yet this prestige came with a hidden cost. The more Germany invested in each Tiger, the more pressure weighed on the men inside. Each tank represented resources the Reich could barely afford. Losing one meant not just a tactical setback, but a symbolic blow. Crews knew they were expected to fight to the last bolt and rivet.
Reports tell a darker story. Engines overheated. Transmissions cracked under the strain of the Tiger's bulk. More than once, crews were forced to abandon their tanks, not because of enemy fire, but because of mechanical collapse. And in the brutal environment of the Eastern Front, abandonment was rarely an option that led to survival. Soviet forces hunted down stranded Tigers with artillery and infantry. Crews trapped inside their disabled tanks often fought until overrun. For them, breakdown was not inconvenience, it was death. The contrast with Allied production methods was stark. American Shermans were lighter, simpler, easier to repair. Soviet T-34s could be welded together in factories relocated deep into the Urals. Both nations accepted battlefield losses, knowing replacements would flow in by the thousands. Germany could not. Every Tiger was a prize, a symbol, and therefore a burden. Veterans later recalled the sense of inevitability. One Tiger gunner captured in 1944 admitted during interrogation, "We felt chosen, yes, but also doomed." The Tiger was too valuable to lose, and that meant we were too valuable to retreat. This sense of sacrifice was baked into the very steel of the tank. It was engineered for dominance, not survival. Its crews were celebrated as knights of a modern armored order, but knights in a war where honor often translated into annihilation. The Tiger's creation story then was not just about engineering brilliance. It was about obsession. Hitler's obsession with prestige weapons, Germany's obsession with battlefield superiority, and the illusion that quality could outweigh quantity. The men chosen to crew the Tiger inherited that obsession. They would fight inside machines that were as rare as they were deadly, as awe-inspiring as they were fragile. They were born into steel, but built on sacrifice. And soon, a chilling order from Hitler himself would ensure that sacrifice was absolute. For the men who climbed into a Tiger tank, the machine was not the only weight they carried. Hanging over them was something far heavier, an order from Adolf Hitler himself. It was an order that turned the Tiger from a weapon of war into a steel coffin. In 1942 and 1943, as the tide of war began to shift against Germany, Hitler grew increasingly obsessed with the image of his new heavy tanks. To him, the Tiger was not simply a battlefield asset, It was a symbol of German power meant to project invincibility to friend and foe alike. In speeches and directives, he described the Tiger as the Reich's answer to Allied mass production, the tank that would terrify opponents and restore German confidence. But that symbolic value came with a terrible cost. German high command, under Hitler's orders, issued directives that no heavy tank, especially Tigers, was to be abandoned intact. Withdrawal was discouraged. Surrender was unthinkable. Crews were to fight on even if their vehicles were disabled and destroy the tank themselves only as a last resort.
Captured documents, later analyzed by Allied intelligence, confirm the standing order. A 1943 Panzer Command directive instructed the Tiger must never fall into enemy hands. Crews will resist to the last shell. If the tank can no longer fight, it will be destroyed on sight. In practice, this meant one thing. Crews were often trapped. If their Tiger was immobilized by a mechanical breakdown or enemy fire, they were expected to hold their ground, firing until they were killed or overrun. The massive machine that gave them prestige and protection now became their prison. Accounts from surviving crewmen, gathered in post-war interrogations, make clear how suffocating this order felt. One loader from Schwerpanzerabteilung 503 told Allied interviewers in 1945, "We were told from the beginning there was no retreat. If the Tiger stopped, so did we. It was our duty to die with it." This doctrine was rooted in Hitler's worldview. He admired the Japanese code of Bushido, where warriors were expected to embrace death rather than surrender. For him, the Tiger crews were Germany's armored samurai. To withdraw was cowardice. To fight to the last was loyalty. The consequences were brutal. In the East, Soviet infantry learned to exploit these orders. They swarmed immobilized Tigers, hurling Molotov cocktails, grenades, and satchel charges. Trapped crews who could not escape the tight hatches were often killed inside. On the Western Front, Allied fighter bombers made a mockery of immobile Tigers. Pilots described watching crews desperately firing their 88mm guns skyward before being obliterated by rockets and bombs. What made this even more tragic was how often these deaths were avoidable. Mechanical breakdowns were common. Fuel shortages left many Tigers stranded. In another army, crews might have abandoned their vehicles and lived to fight another day. But under Hitler's orders, survival was secondary to symbolism. The Tiger had to stand, even if it meant its crew would fall. German after-action reports reveal entire platoons wiped out in this fashion. One battalion commander wrote in frustration in 1944, "We do not fear the enemy so much as our own orders. The Tiger is powerful, but once disabled, it is a tomb." This rigid ideology also crippled tactical flexibility. Commanders could not reposition or withdraw their heavy tanks without explicit permission, and by the time that came, it was often too late. Units were encircled, cut off, and annihilated because they had been ordered to hold ground with immobile machines. For the Allies, these orders were a gift. For the crews, they were a sentence. The standing directive meant that even when the Tiger won on the battlefield, its crews lost on the balance sheet of survival. And as the war dragged into 1943 and 1944, these orders would collide with the reality of attrition on the endless plains of Russia and later in the hedgerows of Normandy, where the myth of the invincible Tiger came crashing down against the simple mathematics of survival.
July 5, 1943, the largest tank battle in history erupted across the Russian steppe. Operation Citadel, the German attempt to cut off the Kursk salient, was meant to be a decisive blow against the Red Army. At the tip of the spear were Hitler's prized heavy tanks, the Tigers. For months, German propaganda had built up the Tiger as the unstoppable engine of victory. Now, on the fields of Kursk, they were unleashed in numbers never seen before. Around 150 Tigers, spread across multiple heavy panzer battalions, joined the offensive. Against them stood thousands of Soviet T-34s dug into layered defensive belts of minefields, trenches, and artillery. At first, the Tiger's reputation seemed justified. German after-action reports describe scenes where a single Tiger could knock out a dozen T-34s before being hit in return. The long-range accuracy of the 88mm gun gave German crews an advantage, and Soviet tankers often found themselves destroyed before they could close the distance. Soviet records confirm the carnage. Entire platoons of T-34s were lost in frontal assaults against Tigers. But the statistics hide the deeper truth. Kursk was not a battlefield designed for duels. It was a battlefield designed for attrition. The Soviets had laid over 500,000 mines. Artillery pounded advancing German formations. Anti-tank rifles and dug-in 76mm guns targeted the Tiger's weaker side armor. And, most devastating of all, the Luftwaffe no longer ruled the skies. Soviet aircraft strafed German armored columns with bombs and rockets. Tigers were trapped in this killing zone. Heavy and cumbersome, they bogged down in the muddy soil and thick Russian dust. Mechanics recorded countless breakdowns, snapped tracks, overheated engines, shattered transmissions. A Tiger stuck in a minefield was not just disabled, it was doomed. Crews followed Hitler's orders and held their ground, firing until they were surrounded. Few made it out. One survivor from Schwere Panzerabteilung 505 recalled years later, "We destroyed many T-34s, but it did not matter. The Russians had more. Always more. When our Tiger was hit, we stayed, as ordered. I escaped, but the others burned." Soviet tactics evolved rapidly. Rather than wasting tanks in frontal charges, they began to coordinate massed artillery and infantry assaults against isolated Tigers. Red Army soldiers described throwing satchel charges beneath immobilized tanks, while others pinned the crew inside with machine gun fire. In post-war interviews, Soviet veterans admitted they feared the Tiger, but they learned to smother it with numbers. By the battle's end, the Tiger's kill ratios looked impressive on paper. Some units reported destroying 10 Soviet tanks for every Tiger lost. But the human cost was staggering. German records show that entire Tiger companies were reduced to fragments. Even when a tank survived, many crews did not. Fire, smoke, and the brutal reality of encirclement ensured that escape was rare. And Kursk marked a turning point. The Red Army had endured the Tiger's hammer blow and survived. From that summer onward, the Germans would never again seize the strategic initiative in the East. For the Tiber crews, the meaning was clear. They were now fighting a war of attrition they could not win, trapped by both the enemy and their own orders. In the months after Kursk, Tigers continued to appear on the Eastern Front. They fought in the retreat through Ukraine, at Kyiv, and later in the desperate defenses of Belarus. Each battle followed the same pattern, tactical brilliance offset by strategic futility. Tigers inflicted losses, but they could not stop the Soviet tide. And with each engagement, the 73% fatality rate for their crews crept higher. The Eastern Front, vast and merciless, became a graveyard for Tiger battalions. Kursk was not the end of the Tiger's story, but it was the moment the myth began to crack. For the men inside, survival was no longer about victory. It was about enduring one more battle, one more order, one more day inside the steel coffin. June 6, 1944, Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, and with them came the greatest concentration of Allied armor the German army had ever faced on the Western Front. Waiting inland, concealed in the hedgerows and villages of northern France, were the Tigers. Elite formations like SS Panzerabteilung 101, commanded by the now legendary Michael Wittmann, were tasked with holding back the tide. The Bocage countryside seemed ideal for ambushes. Tigers crouched behind stone walls and hedgerows, waiting for Allied columns. Their 88mm guns ripped through Sherman tanks at ranges that left the Americans stunned. Crews reported that even heavy British Churchill tanks fell quickly when caught in a Tiger's sights. The Allies soon learned that approaching Normandy villages often meant rolling straight into a Tiger's killing ground. But the battlefield in France was not Africa or even the Eastern Front. Here, the Allies commanded the skies. By 1944, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. P-47 Thunderbolts, Typhoons, and P-51 Mustangs prowled overhead, armed with rockets and bombs. Allied pilots quickly learned to identify the broad outline of a Tiger and called them prime targets. German tankers dreaded the howl of aircraft engines almost more than Soviet artillery. One veteran later wrote, "We feared the Thunderbolts more than the Shermans. Against planes, even the Tiger was helpless." The Allies also compensated for their weaker tanks with numbers and coordination. U.S. and British reports describe entire formations concentrating fire on a single Tiger until it was disabled, while infantry swarmed with bazookas and Piats to finish the job. Shermans with 76mm guns and later Fireflies armed with the powerful British 17-pounder could penetrate a Tiger's armor at closer ranges. No single Allied weapon guaranteed success, but combined arms, tanks, artillery, aircraft, and infantry proved devastating. The most famous Tiger duel of Normandy occurred on June 13th at Villers-Bocage. Michael Wittmann's Tiger rampaged through a British armored column, destroying dozens of vehicles in minutes. The event became legendary in German propaganda, portraying the Tiger as invincible. But the reality was sobering. Later that day, Wittmann's own Tiger was destroyed,
likely by a British Firefly or an airstrike. His death highlighted the paradox of the Tiger, moments of brilliance overshadowed by inevitable destruction. By late July, as the Allies broke out of the Normandy hedgerows in Operation Cobra, Tigers could not keep pace. Their heavy weight bogged them down in soft terrain, while fuel shortages limited mobility. Retreating crews often sabotaged their own tanks rather than risk capture. U.S. engineers later marveled at the sheer number of abandoned Tigers littering the French countryside, machines not defeated in direct combat, but by the logistical collapse of the German war effort. The winter of 1944 brought the last great German gamble, the Ardennes Offensive, better known as the Battle of the Bulge. Once again, Tigers led the charge. In the snowy forests of Belgium, their firepower inflicted severe losses on surprised American units. At places like Stavelot and La Glaise, entire Sherman platoons were wiped out in minutes. But the story repeated itself. The Tigers ran out of fuel, became bogged down in mud and snow, and were targeted relentlessly by Allied aircraft. In one documented case, German crews abandoned perfectly functional Tigers, setting them ablaze because gasoline could not reach the front. By January 1945, the offensive had failed, and the Western Front became a relentless retreat. For Tiger crews, survival meant less and less with each passing month. They fought bravely, and in small engagements they remained terrifying opponents. But the tide was irreversible. Against the overwhelming industrial might of the United States and the coordination of Allied forces, even the Tiger could not change the outcome. The Western campaigns proved what the Eastern Front had already shown. The Tiger was a weapon of fear, not of strategy. Its presence could delay defeat, but it could not deliver victory. And for the men inside, every ambush, every duel, every desperate defense only added to the casualty list that defined their grim statistic: 73% never returning home. The Tiger was more than a weapon. It was a symbol. From the moment it rolled onto the battlefield in 1942, Nazi propaganda portrayed it as a mechanical demigod, a tank that no enemy could withstand. Photographs of Tigers crushing obstacles, posters declaring their invulnerability, and newsreels featuring so-called Panzer heroes filled German cinemas. For a nation suffering under air raids and rationing, the Tiger became a fantasy of control.
Central to this myth were the so-called Tiger Aces. Names like Michael Wittmann, Otto Karius, and Kurt Nispel were elevated to near-legendary status. Newspapers reported their kill counts with breathless admiration. 100, 150, even 200 tanks destroyed. These figures became rallying cries for a population desperate for victories. But the truth, buried in both Allied and German archives, was far more complicated. Take Wittmann. His rampage at Villers-Bocage was real, a single Tiger ambushing a British column and inflicting catastrophic losses. Yet even Wittmann's career illustrates the contradiction of the Tiger myth. Less than 2 months later, his own tank was destroyed. Eyewitnesses describe it burning on the roadside, its crew trapped inside. German propaganda
never showed those images. Instead, Wittmann was immortalized as a martyr. His death spun into yet another symbol of sacrifice. Otto Karius, another celebrated Tiger commander, later admitted in his memoirs that kill tallies were often exaggerated. He described engagements where multiple crews claimed the same destroyed tank, and where propaganda officers inflated numbers for morale. "We were not gods," he wrote. "We were soldiers in machines that broke down and burned like any other." His candor in post-war years stripped away much of the illusion. For the crews themselves, the propaganda was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it gave them status. Tiger battalions were elite, their members admired by comrades and civilians alike. On the other hand, it set impossible expectations. Every Tiger crew was expected to perform like Wittmann, to achieve the impossible against overwhelming odds. Orders to hold positions at all costs often stemmed from this mythical belief in the Tiger's invincibility. The reality that the tank could be destroyed by a mine, a bazooka, or even mechanical failure was inconvenient to acknowledge. Allied soldiers, too, contributed to the myth. Reports from U.S. and British units frequently overestimated the number of Tigers encountered. Any German heavy tank became a Tiger, whether it was actually a Panther, a Panzer IV, or even a self-propelled gun. The Tiger's reputation grew larger than the number actually produced, only about 1350. In the minds of Allied troops, Tigers seemed to lurk in every hedgerow and behind every ridge. This reputation worked both ways. It sowed fear, forcing Allied commanders to plan elaborate operations whenever a Tiger was rumored nearby. But it also ensured that every Tiger destroyed was celebrated disproportionately. Allied propaganda made burning Tigers a visual counterweight to the myth, proving that Germany's invincible weapon could and would fall. Behind the front lines, ordinary Germans clung to the Tiger as a symbol of hope. Letters from civilians in 1944 often mention the new heavy tanks as proof that final victory was possible. Yet the men who actually crewed those tanks knew better. For them, the Tiger was less a symbol of strength than a sentence of attrition. They saw comrades killed in flaming wrecks, struggled with constant breakdowns, and realized that propaganda had turned them into icons of a lost cause. Post-war interrogations of surviving Tiger crewmen revealed the psychological toll. Many admitted that the myth of the Tiger made them targets, not just for the Allies, but for their own command. "We were told the fatherland expected miracles, but miracles do not stop artillery shells," one veteran said in 1946. The paradox of the Tiger was complete. It was both feared and doomed, worshipped and wasted. Its aces were real men whose stories were twisted into legend, their victories inflated, their deaths sanitized. And in the gap between propaganda and reality lay the harsh statistic: 3 out of 4 Tiger crewmen never returned home.
By 1944, the Tiger had become both a prize weapon and a death trap. The machine itself was formidable, but its crews faced odds that grew worse with each passing month. Attrition, not battlefield duels, explains why nearly 3/4 of them never returned home. The most obvious factor was scarcity. Only about 1,350 Tigers were built. Unlike Panzer IVs or Panthers, Tigers could not be replaced quickly. Each loss was permanent, and every destroyed tank meant trained men gone with it. A Tiger crew usually numbered 5: commander, gunner, loader, driver, and radio operator. When a Tiger was lost, odds were high that not just one, but all 5 would be killed. Survivors were rare, particularly if the tank brewed up in flames. Records from the 503rd Heavy Panzer Battalion illustrate this grim math. In July 1944, during the Soviet summer offensive, the unit reported losing 45 Tigers in a single month. Replacement tanks, fewer than a dozen. Replacement crews, virtually none. Men were expected to fight until killed or captured. As a result, the casualty rate climbed relentlessly. Mechanical failure compounded the danger. The Tiger's Maybach engine strained under its 57-ton weight. Gearboxes broke, suspensions collapsed, and engines overheated. In theory, recovery crews could tow damaged Tigers back for repair. In practice, a crippled Tiger often had to be abandoned, and abandoned tanks attracted enemy fire. Crewmen left stranded were either killed in place or cut down while trying to escape. Even when the Tigers fought at peak condition, attrition was unavoidable. The Allies learned quickly. In North Africa and Italy, infantrymen devised tactics to isolate and disable Tigers with mines, bazookas, and artillery. In Normandy, U.S. and British forces swarmed them with Sherman tanks, knowing that sheer numbers could overwhelm even a Tiger's armor. Soviet doctrine went further still. Saturate the battlefield with T-34s, anti-tank guns, and Katyusha rockets. A Tiger could kill 5, 10, even 15 enemy vehicles. But eventually, one round found its mark. For crews, the psychological toll was immense. Surviving diaries tell of constant dread, of artillery barrages collapsing dugouts, of Soviet infantry swarming tanks with Molotov cocktails, of Allied fighter bombers prowling overhead. The worst was not the tank battle. One survivor of the 101st Heavy Panzer Battalion later recalled, "It was the feeling that the entire world was hunting us." By late 1944, attrition was no longer measured only in machines destroyed, but in men wasted. Training new Tiger crews had become nearly impossible. The Panzer schools at Paderborn and Fallingbostel could not keep pace with losses. Green crews were rushed into combat after only weeks of instruction, lacking the experience that had once given Tiger units their edge. Many of these replacements lasted days before their tanks and lives were snuffed out.
The result was a downward spiral. The more losses Tiger units suffered, the less effective survivors became. Shortages of fuel forced many to abandon their tanks without firing a shot. Spare parts vanished under Allied bombing campaigns. By the last months of the war, many Tigers fought as immobile bunkers, their crews condemned to die in place. Post-war German officers were blunt in their assessments. General Heinz Guderian noted that the Tiger consumed resources as though it were invincible, but its crews were sacrificed in numbers we could not replace. Allied interrogations of surviving Tiger tankers painted a darker picture, a recognition that the propaganda of the Tiger's invulnerability had sealed their fate. "We were expected to die in them," one said simply. Attrition, not defeat in a single battle, explains why 73% of Tiger crews never returned. It was a grinding process, a slow bleeding of men and machines across every front. No matter how skilled the crew or how thick the armor, the war's sheer weight bore down until only a fraction survived. By 1943, the Allies had accepted a sobering fact. No single tank in their arsenal could consistently match the Tiger in a one-on-one fight.
The Tiger's 88mm gun outranged and outpunched every Sherman, Churchill, and T-34 on the battlefield. Its armor could shrug off hits that would have shattered lesser machines. To defeat it, Allied armies abandoned the duel and adopted a different philosophy: overwhelm the beast with numbers, firepower, and coordination. In North Africa, American and British tankers first learned this lesson the hard way. Reports from the Battle of Tunisia described Shermans firing dozens of rounds at Tigers without effect, only to be destroyed in return by a handful of precise German shots. But those same reports also revealed the Tiger's Achilles heel. It could not engage every target at once. U.S. and British commanders responded by organizing attacks that forced the Tiger to divide its fire. A single Sherman might not survive, but a platoon of Shermans could swarm the Tiger, encircle it, and eventually deliver a killing blow from the flank or rear. Air power became another critical countermeasure. By 1944, Allied fighter bombers roamed the skies with near impunity. Typhoons, Thunderbolts, and Mustangs carried rockets and bombs specifically designed for armored targets. When a Tiger was spotted, pilots were often vectored in immediately. Crews dreaded the scream of dive bombers as much as they feared Soviet artillery. Allied air superiority turned every road march into a gamble. Many Tigers were lost not to tank duels, but to rocket and bomb strikes before they even reached the front. Infantry tactics also adapted. U.S. bazooka teams and British Piat operators learned to hide in hedgerows, rubble, or foxholes, waiting until a Tiger rumbled past before striking its vulnerable side or rear. Soviet soldiers developed entire assault groups armed with mines, Molotov cocktails, and anti-tank rifles. These teams accepted high risks, often suffering heavy casualties, but they proved that even the most feared tank could be disabled by determined infantry.
Behind the lines, Allied intelligence circulated manuals and briefings designed to demystify the Tiger. In Normandy, pamphlets distributed to U.S. GIs stressed that while the Tiger was dangerous, it was not invincible. They highlighted weak points, the tracks, engine compartment, and lower hull, and encouraged soldiers to aim for them. This psychological counteroffensive chipped away at the aura of invulnerability that German propaganda had built. The Soviets took the concept of swarming to its extreme. At Kursk in July 1943, entire brigades of T-34s charged German heavy tank units. Losses were appalling, but the strategy worked. Tigers could destroy dozens of attackers, but eventually they were surrounded, immobilized, or forced to retreat. Soviet accounts describe battlefield scenes where Tigers stood like islands in a sea of burning T-34s, powerful but hopelessly outnumbered. It was a brutal calculus: sacrifice machines and men in order to grind down Germany's few elite tanks. The Allied response was not purely tactical, it was also industrial. The U.S. could build 50 Shermans in the time it took Germany to build one Tiger. Britain's factories produced waves of Fireflies, up-gunned Shermans carrying the 17-pounder gun, which could penetrate a Tiger's armor at respectable ranges. By the end of 1944, sheer production and deployment meant that even if a Tiger destroyed 10 opponents, there were always more coming. For Tiger crews, this shift in Allied strategy was devastating. Instead of facing one opponent at a time, they confronted swarms. Instead of operating in relative safety, they became high-value targets for artillery, airstrikes, and concentrated assaults. A Tiger was still lethal, but every engagement increased the odds that its crew would never escape. By the war's final year, the pattern was set. Wherever Tigers appeared, Allied forces concentrated overwhelming firepower against them. No longer was the Tiger a predator roaming freely. It was prey, hunted by entire formations. The myth of the invincible tank endured in propaganda, but on the battlefield, attrition by swarming tactics made survival increasingly rare. The Tiger still commanded respect, but the numbers tell the truth. Outnumbered, outproduced, and outflanked, its crews were ground down in a war of exhaustion they could never win.